Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Marc Graben.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. We are joined today by Marc Lushington-Murray. Marc, how are you?
I'm really good. Thank you, Mark. And thank you very much for having me on this show. It's a real honor.
Well, I'm glad you could be here, and I've enjoyed our conversations before and happy to have you share your story and insights with the audience here today. So one thing I think it's interesting, maybe to ask you to start off, the idea that you found lean when you were just 19 years old. I was wondering if you could talk about how that came to be.
Well, it was actually a little bit late. I went back and checked the dates, but basically I was doing my university course, and I came across a book that was the Lucas Engineering Systems handbook. And I'm in my very early 20s. I was doing an engineering degree, and I started reading this book, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is so different than what I'm seeing at work, because in England, typically you'll go to university on day release and then you'll do 4 days at work. So it's quite good, really, because you actually get to use what you're learning at school and take it back to work. And I started reading this book and thought, wow, this is so different. And I had a really good relationship with our general manager. And I said to him, hey, can I create a cell with our development workforce so I don't interfere with mainstream production, and I'll be able to bring everything into one cell instead of going to 5 or 6 different departments. And he said, absolutely. I think I was his lost son at the time. And so he let me set this cell up, and it was absolutely amazing. It was transformational. We had one operator making the product from start to finish, be it in relatively low volumes, because it was automotive and it was a startup project. So we did that. And then at that time, Nissan built their first factory in the UK, and they chose us as their tier 1 supplier. And I got to run that project, to integrate it into the business. And I had 2 guys from Japan teach me what I'd read in the book.
Yeah.
Now, it was a very nice style, I have to say. It wasn't what I hear is the normal, typical Japanese style. And I think it may have had something about they wanted to be successful in the UK as well.
Yeah.
And that was really my journey. They actually taught me hands-on how to lay out the factory for them. And about 3 years later, we got Supplier of the Year award from them. So it was great. And I have to say, it's become my hobby. I love it.
Yeah. So that developmental cell, did that experiment end up being the proof of concept that led to transformation of the rest of manufacturing there? Or I'm curious how that played out.
It really did, because once that experimental cell was a success, my GM gave me the biggest cell that we had in the plant, but at the time supplied Ford. And I had responsibility for the operators and the whole shooting match, and the results. It's the old 80-20 rule. 20% of your products account for 80% of your revenue. And it was such a roaring success, particularly for delivery. I think by the time I got to 25, 26, they then asked me to run the plant. And that's been a history of my whole career, really. I go in to do a lean role, and then people say, hey, why do we need a lean guy or a manufacturing guy? Just let's have one guy. So typically during my career, I have run every plant I've worked at.
So leading, if you will, the lean transformation from the role of plant manager as opposed to being an internal consultant to the plant manager, like a lot of people end up doing.
Yes, and I think it's been. I had a general manager once say to me, "Why would I need an internal consultant to tell someone how to do what he already does? I can save one salary and look after you better, and you won't get frustrated because you won't have anybody saying no because it's your call."
Yeah. So, you mentioned, what might be considered the more, some of the technical aspects of lean, creating a cell, establishing that flow instead of having the spaghetti diagram all throughout the factory's departments. But then as a plant manager, I'm sure you had the opportunity then to explore the management aspect of lean. And I'm curious what sort of coaching that you got from your Japanese mentors or from Nissan as a customer around the management side.
I think the real number one takeaway, when I started my career at 16, I was an apprentice and I worked on the tools. And so I loved the Gemba. And the Japanese guys said, there's no way you need to be in the Gemba at least 70 to 80% of the time. And they helped me with some visual management tools. And it's interesting, ever since that day, I have never had an office because I consider my office to be the Gemba. And if I need to do a one-on-one or a performance appraisal, I can always find an office. I think an office demonstrates that you're something special. And really, when you're a leader, you're a leader. You're not the person making the money.
Well, and it's interesting you talk about, not having an office or, Paul O'Neill recently passed away. He had been the CEO at Alcoa, and he was very well known for building a new Alcoa corporate headquarters and getting rid of the offices and giving everybody, himself included, an 81 square foot cubicle. So there was, kind of an egalitarian streak to him. Now, he was at headquarters. He wasn't out at a smelting plant or an aluminum plant all the time, but it seemed like he went there a lot. So it's interesting to hear like a little bit of a parallel of the idea of, kind of breaking down the literal office walls, meaning something different to a plant manager than it might mean to the CEO of a global company. But as you're explaining, there's benefits to that, right?
What I really found really interesting is when I visited Nissan, I used to go there quite often. The general manager of this huge company, he never had an office. He was out with all of us, and he came and introduced himself one day because he was sat only about 30 feet away. But at the back of the open office was a suite of office cubicles so that you could go and do one-to-ones and similar things like that. And that really resonated with me.
Mm-hmm. So, I think Nissan, in some ways, is an underappreciated company. Toyota gets, understandably, a lot of the press and hype when it comes to lean. There are some who say Honda is very, very, very similar. And then, Nissan often is left out of the conversation. But I'll tell you, when I was at General Motors in 1995, working in a plant, GM had hired in people from different Toyota suppliers. Then there was one guy, and I remember him now very clearly, Tom Drumright, who came from Nissan in Tennessee. And Tom was as good of a mentor and as good with lean as any of the other people there, which I think speaks to the caliber of the culture and the leadership improvement development that was taking place at Nissan in the US at that time. But I'm curious if you could share more, about their style in terms of, you're a young plant manager, and I'm sure Nissan wants you to do better. What was their style of trying to draw that out of you in the plant?
It was amazing, Mark. up until I looked after Nissan, I looked after our Ford account. And every year we used to get beaten up by Ford for a cost down. It was aggressive. It was horrible. And they really mistreated us, in my opinion. When Nissan came to the UK, they said, look, we're going to help you with Paul. And I said, well, I've read about it, but I don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we're going to help you. We're going to send some engineers to come and work with you to show you how it works. And then I started thinking, wow, this is amazing. And then they said, this is your target cost. And I went, my God, how are we ever going to achieve that target cost? But then they said, we're going to send some manufacturing engineers in to help you. And being a young man in his 20s, having grown up in the automotive industry, this was a complete change for me. And I just couldn't get enough of it because I was learning from people that, yeah, it was incredible. I mean, nobody had the luck that I had. And their whole approach was always about a partnership. And then one day I was in Nissan and they took me to the line and they did their typical draw the circle on the floor. And they said, Mark, you must stand here for an hour. We'll come back in an hour.
Yeah.
And I watched it. And I always remember the circle that they put on the floor for me were where the carpets and the seats were offloaded. Mm-hmm. Now, their supplier of carpets and seats was actually on site. But the truck or the trailer that these components were in, it would get backed up against a line. And there was only one line making mixed model. And the seats and the carpets came out in the colour sequence of the cars coming down the line. And I'm thinking, wow, you must be a rocket scientist to be able to do this.
Yeah.
And, really, Mark, as I said to you earlier, this has become my hobby. I absolutely love it. And, it's so fulfilling when you can see some of these things happening.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious. I mean, what you described, that circle being drawn on the ground, is most often called an Ono circle after Taiichi Ono from Toyota. Did they call it something different since they weren't Toyota people, I wonder?
They just said you have to stand and observe and stay in this circle.
Yeah. So it's really about the consistent principle of stand, study, observe, learn, identify waste.
Yes, and it was really good having the mentors. They'd ask you to make those notes, and you would meet with them afterwards and discuss. And they would always Nissan were very complimentary. They were very complimentary, but they would always try and challenge you to say maybe you didn't see everything. Mm-hmm. Whereas I've had experience of working with Shingijitsu, oh my God, completely night and day. But I'm not saying either one is right or wrong. It's just a different way of operating. So I feel very gifted that I've been able to be exposed to both types of culture.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you more about that. Earlier, you mentioned that other style. And I figured you were referring to the kind of classic Shingijitsu style, which has, in their lineage coming from Ono, leaving Toyota, and some others left Toyota. And, there's you hear stories. In Japan once, I heard, a funny story from somebody that used to work very closely or worked for Ono. He was not part of the Shingijitsu circles, but he would say, that Mr. Ono was aptly named because he would come to the factory and people would say, "Oh no," because he would come and kind of, yell and scream and stomp his feet. And, there's, you're right. I mean, there's a certain style there. So, I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on, they have their strengths and they do a lot of great work. Like I said, it's different styles, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on that kind of classic, or if not stereotypical at this point, Shingijitsu style. What did you learn from that?
I think I learnt the concept of getting back to basics. The one thing I really did like about Shingijitsu, particularly when you look at some of the writings of Nagaya-san and his sayings, is spend no money, take yourself back to nature, do 3P, but it's interesting, Shingijitsu never called it 3P with me. They used to call it 3D, so that it wasn't just the cardboard on the floor.
Yeah.
They would really push us to make it 3D. So I think where I used to get a little bit disheartened is I would work so hard to try and please my sensei, and respectfully, he would challenge me, and I would feel, oh my God, I haven't achieved anything. I've worked so hard. But there is a benefit to that, because if you're mature enough, you will go away and you will think about, what the sensei is really trying to say. It's just very hard. I was running one team one day, and there was a member on it, and my sensei wasn't happy with his participation, and basically he asked him to leave the event. He said, "We don't need you." And I was like, oh my God, you can't talk to people like that. But I think if you're able to reflect with respect, I think it's also a good style. And I learned a lot from them. They were good.
Yeah. I mean, there are different styles of coaching in all sorts of different venues. I mean, one could argue that challenging somebody and even being tough is a way of showing respect. Believing in someone and knowing you can do better. So I'm not going to accept your first answer. I'm going to challenge you to go back and do it again. And so you hear this in sports. There are some coaches that are considered disciplinarians, and then maybe a team gets tired of them, and then they bring in what they call a players coach, who's softer around the edges maybe, and then the team stops listening to them, and then the pendulum swings back. So maybe there's a time and a place for those different styles and those different modes.
Yeah, and I think when I look over my career, I also had the benefit of being mentored by Rick Harris. And Rick he's a great guy, really great guy, and he would tell me to do things, and even I thought there's no way I can do that. And then I had the lucky pleasure to be mentored by Kevin Dugan. And, Kevin is, I would call him a bit of a maverick, but he's a sharp guy. So I feel very lucky that I've had a huge spectrum of senseis that has allowed me to work on what my style is. Now, my style will be different than every one of them, but I hope I can take the best out of all of it.
Well, and long-time regular listeners of the podcast might know or remember that Rick Harris's son Chris has been a guest on the podcast twice, going way back to episode 34, and then much more recently. I'm going to look up what that number is. I jotted down 361, and I know that's not quite correct, but it was good to reconnect with him. Rick and Chris, father and son, wrote a book together, and have done a lot of great work. And I can't find. Okay, I'll follow up later. I'll put it in the show notes what that episode was. But for those who don't know Rick and Chris, can you share a little bit about their backgrounds?
Well, I think Rick, if I'm not mistaken, was the first US assembly manager at Kentucky. And, he's written Making Materials Flow. I think that and mixed model production are their trademarks. And when Rick told me I needed to really seriously think about putting in a tugger, I couldn't I couldn't comprehend it. And so I bought one because I was a plant manager. It sat in my receiving department for about 6 weeks. And then one day I got onto it and I started driving around to these imaginary bus stops. Everybody in the factory was laughing at me. They were calling me Thomas the Tank Engine. I mean, it was embarrassing. But, 2 months on, that tugger was the only thing that moved material in the whole facility. And my general manager and I would discuss many times what the benefits were, and we could not figure it out. But it was massive, to the point, before we did that, we had a sales manager who had left us, and he came back, and he came out onto the plant one day with me, and he said, "Mark, don't you have any work?" I said, yeah, we've got loads of work. He said, "You can't do it. It's so quiet here. I can't see anybody running around. I can't see anybody moving. So you can't have any work." And I said, "That's because the tugger moves everything." Yeah. And so that was really my thing with Rick. And then Rick taught me a class, and I had the absolute pleasure of helping him and his wife in Frankfurt with their luggage. It was almost like an honor. I was a young guy. I could carry all their luggage. And that was a tremendous honor.
Yeah. And so as you moved along, I was wondering if you could talk about, as your career progressed, transition from Nissan to Parker Hannifin. And Parker Hannifin is another company I think is very highly regarded in terms of their lean practices. How did that progress for you?
Well, I always knew once we got married, we would like to come to the US. One, I don't like the weather in England, and I love the weather in Fort Worth. Yeah. And so I went and worked for Parker Hannifin. I went there originally as their lean manager, and after 3 months, they made me the manufacturing and lean manager.
Yeah, there you go again, right? Yeah.
Again. Yeah. So we worked really hard, and the benefit was when I arrived, we weren't making a huge amount of money. We were in the middle of nowhere in England, and we thought, Parker Hannifin being a $14 billion corporation, that they would probably close us. And so trying to get change, there was a real reason. We wanted to do well. And so we worked, it wasn't me, it was the team. And, it was amazing, but we actually became the first lean model plant in the whole of Parker Hannifin. Mm-hmm. And that was a tremendous award for us because, I think at some point we thought we were better than we actually were. And I think going through that assignment and assessment proved to me that really we were just scratching the surface. So Parker Hannifin gave us the first lean model plant, probably my 15 minutes to fame. And I then approached Parker and said, "Hey, would it be possible to come to the US?" And they said, "Sure, come to Cleveland, to head office." And I went, no, Cleveland's too cold for me. I'm not sure I would want to do that. And they said, "Okay, we got an opportunity in Houston." So I said, "Yeah, love it." We came out with not even checking Houston out. We just came out.
Yeah.
Boy, that was scary. We got off the plane onto Beltway 8. So again, I came in as lean manager. I looked after plants in Italy, Norway, Sweden, Mexico, Ohio. And then they asked me to run the local plant as well. Mm-hmm. So that was all going great. And then they did an acquisition. And they said, "Hey, Mark, will you go up and run the new acquisition and integrate the Parker values?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all." And then about a year and a half ago, they said, we're building a brand new facility in Fort Worth. Would you go to Fort Worth and help create the culture ready for when we move into the building? I said, no problem. So, Parker Hannafin gave me what my company in England couldn't. They gave me global travel. They gave me everything a young man pursuing a career could ever want. Yeah, a great company, I have to say.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on your mindset or what you were looking for and how much time you were given when you talk about going to Fort Worth and trying to establish the culture in that plant. How would you describe that ideal culture that you were looking to set up there? Okay,
this is a good question, because I think this is one of the biggest learning moments I've had in my career. They moved me to Fort Worth. Everything was going great. They made me plant manager as well, and that was looking after about 500-600 people. And I had never, ever worked in aerospace. It was my very first time. And I feel, because I came from the industrial world or automotive, in that world, if you don't deliver your parts at the price, tomorrow you're not going to have any work. And so when I came to aerospace, the attitude was completely different. It was, oh, well, it's okay. The contract's for 15 years. We'll be okay. And it takes two to tango in every situation. And I think my industrial style wasn't suited at the time to the aerospace style. So I think they asked me to do the job. They asked me then to run the plant after being there for 6 months. But I think, because I'm English, I will tell people how it is. And I don't think that goes down particularly well in aerospace.
No? Being English, you do it politely, or it's perceived that way, isn't it?
I hope so.
I thought Americans tended to be a little bit more blunt.
Well, you could be right, Mark. You could be right. The one thing I do know is I could not think of anywhere better to live in the world. I love it here.
Yeah. And I was trying to say the countries are different. They're both lovely countries. I've really enjoyed the time. I haven't had as much time in England as you've had here in the U.S., but we can celebrate the charming differences and everything. But maybe I don't know if there's a parallel. There's we always say between British English, American English, sometimes we're separated by a common language, as you've heard that expression. Between automotive and aerospace, like what were some of the similarities when you would describe a lean culture? Some of the things that were consistent, and some of the things where it was maybe I don't know if it was charming or not, but it was a difference.
I think in the automotive industry, and this is just my experience, and I could be wrong, but I think it's survival of the fittest. Absolutely. So people in that industry recognize how powerful lean is. And, I would compare automotive to living the values of lean and genuinely trying to make it happen. And I think when you look at an industrial conglomerate like Danaher, I think they're very similar. I think in aerospace, for the right reasons, I'm sure, because of air traffic safety and things like that, the willingness to change is very minimal once a product has been achieved. Even to the point, changing the manufacturing method, even if you were to move a machine 2 foot to the left, in automotive, there's a procedure you need to go through and document, but in aerospace, you need the customer to actually come to site in some cases and approve it. So I think in aerospace, the rules limit the creativity.
When you talk about that survival of the fittest, I wonder if I've only worked in automotive and not in aerospace, but I wonder if there's a bit of a dynamic where in automotive, sometimes an OEM threatens to switch suppliers and uses that as leverage. Maybe that's more the Ford or Detroit model, but maybe are they more kind of long-term locked-in relationships in aerospace? I wonder that leads to maybe a different urgency or just a different culture. I'm kind of speculating off the top of my head, but I'm wondering.
I'm trying to answer it, and I would say I would agree with you in automotive with the experiences I had with Ford back in the 90s and the late 80s. And I'm sure that's changed now. The world has moved on. But with Nissan, it was a partnership. And every day I went to work, I knew it was a partnership. Sure, there was an expectation. Mm-hmm. But the expectation was, if you can't figure it out, we're going to help you. And that's different. In aerospace, I think, you think of a Boeing that have a huge reputation for lean. But as you start going down the supply chain, I wonder how many people are really, truly committed to lean as they have got the long-term relationships.
That's a good question, and I'm sure there's variation from company to company and plant to plant, industry to industry. One other thing we were going to talk about was you've talked about lean and variations of the Toyota production system. Did Six Sigma enter your work as a leader? And I'm curious what you saw in terms of overlap or coexistence between lean and Six Sigma.
Oh my God, that is a hard question. So early in my career, I always favored lean over Six Sigma because I believe lean is eliminating waste and Six Sigma is reducing waste. Variation.
Yeah.
And so I think I was, as a young man, I was very narrowly focused on the lean side of it. And then as I've got older, I've realized that actually both disciplines have a lot to offer. It's really where do you use them? And so for me, I can't favor either discipline. I think both are equally important, but I do believe your starting point should probably be eliminating waste before you try to get to eliminate the variation. And, I took a black belt. Unfortunately, although I've done all the qualified classroom work, when my company moved me to Fort Worth, I said, hey, what about my project? And they said, focus on the new building, then you can do your project. So I'm not certified, but I believe I could be certified within 3 or 4 months.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with you. There's a time and a place for each. I wasn't trying to set it up as which is better, which is the only one to use. I think there's overlap in different ways. Arguably within lean or TPS, we're also focusing on reducing variation, through standard work and other practices. So one other thing we were going to touch on here is Toyota Kata, and a more recent development. I think Marc Rother's book is about 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, how did you get exposed to that, and what were your perceptions of that as say an experienced lean practitioner? I was I would say also an experienced lay practitioner when I've been exposed to it. I've never been, I have nothing against it. I've never really been diehard into that community. I'm curious what your experiences were.
So as I said, Mark, lean is my hobby, and when Mike's book came out, I bought it immediately, and it appealed to me. Because I'm an analytical guy, Kaizen can occasionally stress me out. It's not a problem, running a week Kaizen event, but it can be very stressful that you're trying to get the result so quick.
Sure.
And being analytical, that's not in my nature. So I read Mike's book, and at the time they had moved me to the new acquisition in Houston, and I said to one of my supervisors, "Let's give this a try." And so I was the coach, he was the learner, and I have to say the results we achieved, be it over a longer period, were outstanding. Not only in people's development, because it wasn't all full on for a week, it was remarkable. And, I will never abandon Kaizen, because I think Kaizen has its place. But if you're really trying to get to that target condition, I really like Mike's process. So for me, I'm self-taught. I'm comfortable being a coach doing it. And in fact, I'm very lucky in that I'm working with wonderful Karen Ross and Katie Anderson.
Oh, good.
I think their process is very similar to Mike's, but it's very much more human. And I like what that side of it brings. So I'm actually a big fan of Mike's work. I think he did a great job and he helped the community. But that does not mean that you forget about Kaizen.
Yeah, and Mike is brilliant. He's a great teacher, and when I get exposed to kata, and I think I recognize better now the differences as I've been coached and mentored by people. So when you're talking about Kaizen events, that kind of classic, typical 4 or 5 day thing that I think was basically a creation of Shingijitsu consultants. And I distinguish Kaizen events, or I would say Kaizen events are a form of Kaizen. Then there's also more of the, you might call daily continuous improvement, small incremental improvements done by team members and mentored by somebody. Like, to me, the Toyota Kata process is very similar to that style of Kaizen. And Toyota Kata adds models that approaches that are helpful, where I would say I think it's a form of PDCA, but there's more to it than I think what a lot of us were taught about basic PDCA in terms of coaching and setting a challenge instead of maybe just reacting to waste. There's a lot that Toyota Kata brings to an organization.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Mark, because you can do your daily Gemba walks, but really you're just trying to find out what's normal, abnormal, and trying to address that. I think with a kata, it can say one thing Toyota says is develop people before processes and products.
Yeah.
I think kata is a perfect way of developing people. It's much more powerful for me than Kaizen.
Yeah. Well, one other thing we were going to touch on, and I know you've got some really nice reflections to share about the career transition and search that you're going through right now after leaving Parker Hannifin. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on that.
Yes, as you said, Mark, I'm currently in transition, and I think, having only ever worked for 2 companies, initially it was scary. And then some things have happened in my life in that I've started networking. I've started being able to. This is my first podcast, everyone.
Yeah.
This has been a great learning experience for me. And then I found the time to consolidate all my UK pensions, which is amazing because it really is a minefield. And then my wife contracted cancer, and so I had to take her for chemo and radio. And by the way, she's really doing well, really. She's getting stronger every day. And it suddenly dawned on me, these things are more than just a mistake. Something is behind all of this. There is no way I could get the time to figure out how I could become a better person, how I could get the time to take my wife to hospital, how I could get the time to look at my pensions. And so I think through that journey, I've started to find God. And it sounds strange, but at 56 years, not really thinking much about God, believing him tokenly, this is very powerful. And I believe he absolutely put me in this position. So, yeah, I'm in transition, but it's been a great period of learning for me. And hopefully I can find somebody who's looking for my skills in the Fort Worth area. I'm happy to travel. And I'd be delighted to try and help somebody with my skills and experience, because definitely this transition has made me a better person than when I was in my 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Yeah. Well, it's very nice of you to share those reflections, and during a time that I know from past experience can be stressful, and there's a lot going on right now. So of course, anyway. So thank you for sharing those reflections. Maybe kind of final question to close things off a little bit here. You said that you have been in a lean manager job, and then you end up being pulled into manufacturing management or plant management role. What do you think? What would you prefer at this point? Or I guess some of that, you may get hired into something and then get pulled somewhere else. So who knows? But what are you aiming for?
It's interesting through this journey, Mark. I've been reading a book that's 30 Days to Live. It's written by a pastor in Houston, and he's written it in a language that I can understand. And in there, it said, God put you here to work on your strengths. So I think originally I was looking for a comfortable role. And I don't think that's what God wants from me. I think he wants to challenge me to use my strengths. And so either role would be good. The good thing about plant management is you get to look after the metrics, and you get to really demonstrate to the stakeholders what can be achieved. Whereas if you're just doing the lean role, you're more of an advisor, and you don't get necessarily the credit. So I think either role will be good, but if the past is anything to be learnt from, I think I'll end up with a lean role and end up running the plant again.
Sure. If somebody listening or watching wants to get in touch with you, what would you suggest? Email address or how?
I would absolutely go on to LinkedIn and try and connect with me.
Okay.
And if they would like to do a Zoom call to further the possibilities, I'm really looking for a company where I can come and help. Yeah. I'm not looking for a job.
Yeah. Let's go be of service to a company and its people, it sounds like.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's great. So our guest, a first-time podcast guest anywhere. I'm glad you chose this podcast as your first. I think you did a great job, Mark. Thank you for trying something new, and I think you did real well.
It's been a real pleasure. And I have to say, Mark, you made it so easy for me. And, I've listened to a couple of your other podcasts and I was thinking, yeah, if I get stuck, Marc will help me out.
Yeah. So our guest has been Marc Lushington-Murray. Marc, I look forward to getting back to Texas at some point, and we can get together in person once we're done quarantining here in Florida or wherever. So look forward to seeing you in person sometime.
Yeah, I would love that, and lunch will be on me.
Well, thanks. So again, to the viewers, take a look at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a link to the blog post for this episode, where I'll link to Marc's LinkedIn page. Or again, I think if you go search for Marc Lushington-Murray, they'll find you, right?
Yes, sir. There's not many people on this planet with that name.
Very good. And it's Marc with a C. So again, like our different accents, we've got different spellings of our names. Variety is the spice of life, maybe, huh?
It is indeed, sir. And I've really enjoyed this, and you've given me the confidence to be able to do this sort of thing again.
Okay. Well, very good. Thank you, Marc. Take care.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Marc at leanpodcast@gmail.com.